Welcome to the panel. I'm really excited about this particular a panel because it's something that we've all been thinking about for quite some time. Let me do the introductions first, starting with Brian. Brian is the Executive Director of Hyperledger. He's an American technologist, executive, computer programmer, and leading figure in the open source software movement. He was a primary developer of the Apache web server, a founding member of the Apache Software Foundation. He's on the boards of Mozilla, Benetech, and the Electronic Frontier Foundations. He's also been around in this space for quite some time. Brian was talking about consortium networks and this topic, clubs, blockchain for corporations, permission networks, back in the days when really all you heard in the blockchain space was the libertarian fringe. So Brian, it's great to have you. Looking forward to hearing your perspective on that evolution. Shiv, a technologist, a broadcaster, author, former Guardian investigative journalist. He's done a lot of things. The most interesting man in the world, perhaps. Co-founder of the Intergenerational Foundation think tank. He entered the Web3 space in mid-17 as an advisor to the Golem project, and then as head of growth for Streamer. In 2021, he founded Pool Foundation, and to promote their vision of bringing data unions to the world to ensure that people have control over their data and a genuine stake in the digital economy. Welcome, Shiv. Rich is Managing Director and North America Lead for Blockchain and Multi-Party Systems at Accenture. Rich brings over 20 years of industry experience in building and growing digital businesses and global brands. He's a forerunner in creating innovative products, leveraging IT, digital payments, and tokenized assets with a focus on designing, enabling, and optimizing new commerce models. So a perfect panelist in Rich. Delighted to have you all. Welcome. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of the why and background for why we're having this panel now. And it's really because I've seen an explosion of interest in the past year in the consortium model, in permission chains, in automated business networks. And so there's this sense that's out there that something is going on in this space that's interesting. And people are beginning to talk about it. There's a lot of buzz around it. And so I thought we could have a panel and explore it with the people who are at the forefront of it. It has something to do with the notion of club goods. What kinds of goods do traditional markets not provide well that you really need to have a business network where you can agree on some things, some data structures, perhaps some ways of identifying things, some business processes, ways of exchanging data, some standards. That's a piece of it, and we'll get to that. I was a co-founder of MOBI. MOBI arose from this issue of finding that it was very hard to use blockchain in scale applications. When I was at Toda Research Institute and Toda Financial Services, we began doing a few POCs in blockchain. We found it was fairly easy to put a car or a piece of infrastructure on a chain, but very hard to do anything with it after that. And that was this experience that I had when talking to pretty much everybody else in the space who was doing POCs at the time. And in hindsight, it's very obvious why blockchain is inherently a collaborative technology, unless you have, as Brian always says, it's a team sport. He said that long before other people caught on to that, I think. But we found that as well. And so MOBI was formed out of those discussions and out of those POCs as a way of creating a neutral place to convene, to set standards, to talk about business automation, to talk about how do you identify things. MOBI in particular lately has been interested in building a network, a business network to do that. We call it MOBINet. And we're focusing on a number of things, but in particular, something we call the trusted trip, which is this idea that you can combine the identity of things with its location in space and time. It's ubiety is the word for that. through time to get a trusted trip. And trusted trip is potentially extremely valuable. And so that's something that we think the network, the consortium, can provide to its members that is very monetizable. But let me stop there. I'm sure we're going to get into a lot more. So let me turn the floor over to each speaker to talk a little bit about what they're interested in, what they think is interesting in this space, what they think is new and buzzworthy in this space, and maybe what projects they're either are working with or want to work with. Brian, since you're in the upper left of my screen, why don't you start with you?
Sure. Well, in some ways, this is old hat. I mean, the internet protocols were devised through a very loose consortium of organizations, but primarily individuals working together under the banner of the Internet Engineering Task Force, right, which predominantly did its work over email and occasionally, well, 4 times a year meeting face-to-face, but only really incorporated well into its lifespan as a formal kind of consortia, but was extraordinarily effective in delivering common technology that allowed the internet to grow and everyone to hook up as peers and the like. Fast forward to 1998, and we established the Apache Software Foundation as a charitable nonprofit, but as an organization to serve the interests of the Apache developer community and the Apache software user community. Again, as a cooperative and being friendly to companies, obviously wanting them in orbit, recognizing everyone was employed by them, and the web was about to a large degree creating commercial value. But over time in the open source ecosystem, you've seen commercial consortia emerge, and my current employer, the Linux Foundation, perhaps one of the leading organizations in forming commercial consortia around not just the Linux operating system, but in cloud computing, software-defined networking, automotive software, all these other domains. And so this idea of pulling together stakeholders around a shared technology platform is why when I got involved in blockchain technology, it was well, of course, you have these consortia types of organizations, and you could build those on permission blockchains. You could actually build them as quasi DAOs on top of kind of the public blockchains, right? But you have to have governance. You have to have a way for stakeholders to kind of identify as a community, to talk about common goals, to change course over time, to give a structure for organizations to outlast their originators. And parts of that can be automated. You can automate a whole lot of that. I don't believe that everything is down to a vote, right? Every decision isn't necessarily about who hits the 51% mark on some decision. And so the idea of consortia around blockchain technology is very natural, because blockchain technology itself is a consortium technology. It is not the fastest way to build a ride-hailing network, right? If you want to build a ride-hailing network, build it the way Uber and Lyft built their systems. If you want to build a payment network, build it the way Venmo and PayPal work, right? Blockchain technology is used when you want to solve problems at scale with a community of stakeholders, of peers. And so that looks a lot more like the world I want to live in than a world dominated by central parties in every marketplace, or in every niche, right? So the consortia that we formed around Hyperledger, obviously focused on delivering open source software, not around a particular network. But now it's pretty clear that there's a need for these bespoke networks using blockchain technology in all sorts of domains. And so just as at the Linux Foundation, we've evolved from being just about open source to also being about open standards, and that's something I can go into in a bit. We're recognizing that governance around these multi-party systems, around distributed ledger networks, is there's a need for that, and a need for the same kinds of minimum viable governance that we've always practiced in the open source software communities we formed. So there's a couple of initiatives that we're kind of brewing on that front. One that we launched called OpenIDL, which is specific to the insurance industry and actually regulatory reporting and property and casualty. Very niche, very, very quiet, but representing trillions of dollars at stake, and basically how we measure risk and price risk in the United States, but globally as well. So there's a number of other things we're excited about potentially supporting, but also really excited to see this model scale out and for more industries to recognize that they've got existing structures like this. Almost every industry has a consortium of some sort defining standards, lobbying Congress, doing these kinds of industry-wide kinds of things, and picking up governance of a blockchain network around that seems pretty logical. But for those spaces or organizations who don't recognize that, we'll probably see some new structures emerge. So exciting to see all that happening now.
Great, thanks. A lot in there to unpack. Rich, I'm going to turn to you next because you're kind of coming in from the opposite side, where Brian's coming in from the consortium technology nonprofit foundation side, at least recently. You've been working with the world's largest corporations to solve some of their digitization and enterprise scale problems. So let me ask you to chime in. What are you working in? What are your clients seeing? What do they want in the space?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And first of all, I just wanted to kind of build on a couple of the comments that Brian said. I think when we look at the industry consortium activity, to date, it's really been focused on common challenges across that industry, in that particular industry, where there's friction or some type of a potential issue that that the actors all identify as important to start to resolve. And so from that perspective, one of the things that we're seeing is that the focus has been on being able to transform that industry from the inside out to be able to drive a level of efficiency and cost takeout that results from that effort. I think what's always been interesting to me and what really motivates me is when we move beyond that efficiency play, which adds a tremendous amount of value and can unlock a lot of business value for an entire ecosystem, hands down. But what I'm most excited about is the opportunity for us to be able to create new products and services and new revenue models because of the shared data constructs that these technologies try to provide. And so one of the things that we focus on at Accenture is I work across our 19 industry groups to identify where we can help to create these next markets that unlock business value across that entire ecosystem. And that's focused on, really from the point of helping to set out that strategy and making sure that we always have a solid vision as to what we're going after that is value led, to taking the approach of building out an MVP and an initial governance model, and could not agree more with Brian's comment around the importance of governance to really help manage these ecosystems, and then ultimately moving to production. And I think from a production perspective, it's also important to think about it's not just about the technology. It is about all of the collaboration activities across these consortiums to make the business viable. And then ultimately also it's about the operational side of running these consortiums as well. And then ultimately, how do you scale and create that network effect that we all seek?
Great, thanks. Yeah, this idea that there's value to be unlocked by collaboration outside the walls of the corporation, right, is I think a key piece of this buzz that we're seeing now. Companies have done an enormous amount of digitization inside their walls in the last 20 years, and they've got an appreciation for the so much more that could be done if they could just collaborate across the value chain rather than just people who are their colleagues inside the company. Shiv, I want to bring you in. You've got a great project you're working in, and a great take on sort of what this value is that's out there. Brian alluded to it earlier when he talked, I think, about the type of world you want to live in, and so why don't you tell us what you've done?
Yeah, I think, Brian, maybe you'll agree with this. One way to couch being involved in the Web3 space is that it is using technology to experiment with systems design. And it's just full of that at the moment. I feel like for the last 3 years, it's been a very wild, or 4 years now, wild ride on that front. I can remember, for example, just thinking about, the possibilities with NFTs when they sort of first got devised, and you have a protocol around devising them in a set standards in Ethereum. And they came out in sort of late 2017, and watching that journey just to emanate now. And then people, and the interesting thing about an NFT, for example, is the way in which you can redistribute value back to the original owner. So if you're talking about artists, for example, that artist gets a cut of the sale every time. right? Which is often, you don't end up with the Van Gogh effect, right? Where he dies poor and then, you know, years later, someone comes along and buys it for paintings for 50 million or whatever. So, you know, it's just full of that sort of stuff. And you can, you know, and Chris, I was saying just before the meeting started, you know, there's that ability to A/B test economic systems in a way that you could never really do before, without the horrific failures of, say, a famine at the end of it if you get it wrong, right, at the sort of actual level. So this is great. Specifically, I think the two things that have been, or a handful of things that have been fascinating, obviously, are sort of DAOs. And, you know, personally, when we set up Pool, we also tried to think about taking some of those older ideas, because, you know, people have been, I think, you know, during periods when people are dissatisfied with the status quo, and I mean that on a kind of, you know, wide political level, then people start to question the system and start to do this experimentation. So for Web3 as well, this is a very ripe moment for people to go, yeah, how do we do this differently? Because clearly the status quo isn't working. So we decided to become a foundation, for example, like other Web3 projects. But as Brian will know, it gives a very different culture and flavor to what you do as internally as an organization, right? You're like, your time preference as an organization is different, right? You're not then thinking about shareholder value and that's your main direction, right? You're thinking, how do I optimize for, you know, the next 20 years, right? Because this thing's got to last. That's my KPI, right? This thing has got to last. And that becomes fascinating itself. So specifically, what Pool is doing is a form of system design in creating a data union, right? It's like, how do you ultimately turn the whole data economy? The truth in that is that it is a team sport, but everyone's trying to treat it as it's just like, you know, these are a bunch of rivalrous goods, when actually, in many senses, they're non-rivalrous, and everyone benefits from when there's cooperation rather than competition in many ways. It's easy to see how it's become siloed and why people would do that. So the data union itself is a way for the creators of the data to, i.e. ordinary individuals who create data every single second of every single day as they go about their digital business, to basically club that good together and have a form, an organizer on top, the union organizers, if you want, to be able to aggregate that into a single monetizable product. But you have a bunch of professionals also worrying about your own interests. And from a technological point of view, we're using blockchain not to store data, by and large, though we are using IPFS, but mainly for the payment rails, right? That's the bit that you really want. That's where the trust needs to be most secure, right? You don't want to be storing data basically on 1,000 databases, which is basically, in some senses, what a blockchain also is. So that's why we created these institutions. They exist already. There's lots of actually small innovative startups who have, you know, tens of or even hundreds of thousands of users who model themselves on this, on being a data union. And actually, most interestingly now, the EU has backed this model. They call them data cooperatives, potato, potato. But they're giving legislative life to them with the Data Governance Act, which is out in bill form and is being hammered around by, you know, the Brussels bureaucracy, and should probably be published and enacted by the end of this year. And they're backing that both with, you know, 2 billion euros in funding, but also to give that legislative framework, give it trust, and give them also responsibilities. They have a fiduciary duty to their members to act in their benefit, therefore. And this is going to be a again, another systems design experiment, right? Can you actually create data unions that act in this way? Can you create, interestingly, a raw data layer, right? Because they've also added into this legislative mix the fact that, you know, you can't then just become an analytics company. You have to sell to everyone. If you want an analytics company, you have to sell separately, start a different company. So, you know, this is going to be, again, just a way of upending the whole data economy from the premise that the systems need to be designed differently, right? And that's really fascinating. That's what we're doing at Pool.
Great. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. Let me go back to the notion of consortiums and dig a little deeper into maybe what they do, what they have done in the past, and in the old economy, and then try and explore a little bit about what they should do in the new economy and how it might be different. And I want to take as my example the Visa network. The Visa, I think, is the most successful consortium, and it's the one I know of in the old economy, in the sense that it was established in the late 50s, early 60s out of a problem. Bankers had a new type of transaction to bank. They were called point of sale transactions. In today's lingo, we'd call them edge transactions. But the point is, they weren't happening in the bank lobby. They were out there in the merchant. And when they tried to bank them, they got absolutely killed with fraud, with multiple banking of the same transaction, with identity fraud. And the bankers got together and said, this can't go on. We need to bank these transactions. We have to do it in a different way. We have to do it cooperatively for the first time. And this was totally new for banking. There were something like 15,000 banks in the U.S. and they competed ferociously. And here they were getting together to cooperate. And what they did was they formed a co-op, a for-profit venture, but it was member-owned. It was a club. You had to be a bank to join, and it focused on four things that I call GAIA, which is governance, authority, identity, and assurance. Everybody thinks that Visa is out there moving money around. They're not. They're not settling transactions. They're not giving you a credit score. They don't have a big payments infrastructure up on top. That's all the business models of the Visa members. What they do is they focus on governance, authority, identity, and assurance. And I think that a lot of what blockchain consortiums are thinking about are focusing on those four things. So maybe the question for the group is that right? Is that what the core of these consortiums are doing, or are there other things that they should be doing as well?
I'll jump in. I think that's right. I think the one though that gets a lot easier with blockchain technology is the assurance piece. If you have an organization like a Visa, and I'm pretty sure there is a Visa network, right? There's also organizations like DTCC who have sat at the heart of the securities marketplace in Wall Street since the 60s. When people realized it was easier to trade pointers to shares in a database than it was to have bike messengers with physical stock certificates going between brokers, right? And in all these cases, when you've had a central entity, that entity that holds kind of the core assets or that runs the network, even if it's set up as a co-op, even if it's very trustworthy to not be a rent-seeking kind of organization at the center and charging a huge amount because they are the center of the universe, even with all that, you still had to place a lot of trust in their operations, that they were able to keep the trains running on time, that they were able to always be up, that they were going to be there because they are a critical infrastructure for a marketplace. And that's expensive to maintain that assurance. And if something goes wrong, the parties needed some degree of insurance, some degree of resiliency to know that there's an adjudication process, that all that kind of, that their concerns could be met. With the distributed ledger technology, a lot more of that verification and that resiliency can be pushed to the edge rather than depending upon a central actor. And so the need for indemnification in the case of mistakes, there's still that need, but the cost of providing that drops dramatically, because you can say, here's the ledger that we're all operating against, we're all running nodes on, we all can see the transactions happening on this. You don't have to take my word for it as the central actor, right? I don't have to hire auditors, to go and prove to you that I'm a trustworthy entity, or at least if I do, their job is a lot easier. So I think GAIA still applies, but that assurance piece gets radically cheaper in a blockchain consortium.
Chris, are you saying, in a sense, could a consortium be more than just the provision of GAIA? Could it provide a service inherently? Is that what you're trying to tease out by your question?
I put that to you guys. Is there more? And maybe we can get to business models. If there is, we can get to business models inside the consortium versus business models outside as well. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, I feel that there is more. And in a sense, the notion of a platform sort of comes to mind. And platforms have got a really bad rep at the moment. If you sort of take Amazon as that model, then, the way in which they've been those centralized parties have been able to completely leverage, largely based on the fact of what they know rather than what they're doing as such, right? So it's having that God's eye view has meant a lot in a world where you can scale to billions. And I think that's in a sense, being the main problem? Have they, Bill Gates had something to say about platforms when he said, oh, Facebook isn't a platform. A platform should return more value to its members than it is returning to itself, right? So if you follow that logic, then yes, in a sense, consortiums are really well placed to provide services in effect to themselves. But it's, again, I think it comes down to how the thing's actually built, right? Who owns it? Who owns it matters, right? Because if it's not the people involved, then in the end, that's going to start to break, right? Someone's fiduciary responsibilities will sway one way rather than towards its members. So if you build Visa, Visa can very easily provide its services to the people who own it. And that just works, right? And the corporate model is 160, 70 years old. It's actually older than in British law. I think it was 1852 that cooperatives were instantiated into law. And it's 1856 when the corporation, as we know it now, was put into law. So it actually predates it. So I think actually they can provide services, but depending on how the ownership structures and other governance structures are devised.
Yeah, this is Rich. I might push on that idea just a little bit, because even though a merchant doesn't own an aspect of Visa, they do derive value through its use, because it enables transactions to occur within their commerce capabilities. And so from that perspective, it facilitates the sale of their good and service. And so I think it's also, we need to think about a broad view of how value is created, because it is more than just the transactional fees, for instance, that is generated through a transaction.
Yeah, great
I think
point.
there's one more piece, and I think it might be implicit in the G in GAIA, but it feels distinct, which is road mapping and kind of charting the evolution of the platform. And while I think it's really important to note that the platform in any of these networks should try to push as much value creation and value capture to the edge as possible, sometimes you have to make improvements at the core. Right. Sometimes the technology running on every node needs to be upgraded to a more capable kind of technology, shift from one platform to another, fix bugs. When a bug is noticed in somebody stealing assets, that's a 0-day, like, let's get on this and fix it kind of thing. And so having a process to be able to coordinate across the network upgrades and the evolution of the platform in a way that's cooperative, that it's kind of governance, but governance comes across as like brakes on a system rather than the accelerator. And there's just as much need for the consortium that sits at the heart of these networks to orchestrate and lead in whatever kind of open way that it can, or decentralized way it can, the evolution of the platform underneath.
Is there one other thing that can be added into this, which is transparency, and something that we've been thinking about, and I think which people value about consortia, which is that, especially if you're providing service, that you in turn are transparent with the people who you're providing a service to, in essence, or your members, because then it just levels that playing field, right? So, and it also provides that knowledge base to everyone else. Again, so you can't leverage that advantage. And it's interesting that, again, when you look through the legislation that Europe's putting through, for example, or, that even US legislators are looking at, they're like, you have to reveal to your members what is going on. That's it's important for them. And so it seems to make another vital part of that success.
So another aspect of, I know we've talked a lot about governance, and specifically as it relates to Visa, one of the things that I think is really interesting around Visa is they have a very defined set of operating rules. In fact, if you've ever looked at the operating rules, if I recall correctly, I think it's well over 1,000 pages of content. To be able to define the standards and the expectations of all of the parties in the model. And one of the things that I find most interesting, and where I think personally, one of the things that I think that Visa does incredibly well is change management, is really evaluating when a change needs to be made, Brian, to your point, to the core, for instance, to really understand what the impact is to the payment processors, to the merchants, to the FIs that issue the cards, and even to the consumers that hold the cards. And then being able to figure out a methodical way to be able to implement that across the world so that we don't have an opportunity where the core value proposition of the card is impacted. I mean, the core value proposition is that if I see the logo at a store, I know I can use my card, right? That true interoperability at a global scale is one of the key value propositions that the Visa brand, the Visa network provides. And so in order to protect that value proposition for the consumer, but also for the merchants and the banks, having that structured governance process, having that change management process is really critical to be able to facilitate that promise to the market.
Yeah. So you're getting back to sort of this notion of how do you extend digital efficiencies outside the corporate walls, and through the whole value chain. Brian, you mentioned earlier the DTC and the bike messengers, and I hadn't thought of it before, but yeah, that may be the first instance of a digital twin at scale, replacing the bike messenger. And so I think from that we can say, well, one of the things that the identity piece of it is really important. This idea that you can create efficiencies by having common identities that are trusted by everybody and can be used and shared within the network. So let's turn a little bit more to the. Go ahead,
Chris. Sorry,
Yeah.
Can I comment on your identity comment? Because I think it is really a critical aspect of these consortiums and of these transactions that that we're talking about here. I mean, identity of a person, of an entity, or of a thing is typically core to just about any use case. And that's why, the vehicle identity standard that MOBI is defined, I think really is paramount to a lot of what we're talking about here. And if you think about it in the context of, either a payment that's associated around a vehicle or a transfer of ownership or, car sharing or what have you, we have to fundamentally understand the entity that we're operating with. If we don't, then there is inherent risk in the transaction. And I think as we move forward here, I think this is such a critical element for us to be able to understand, and it may actually need to drive new standards across other areas of the economy beyond what we can influence on our own. And let me give you an example. When e-commerce really came onto the market in the late 90s, and individuals started using, existing cards, on an online site, we had to really think about how to be able to appropriately manage the risk of those transactions. Not only did we have to do the normal, is the card open? Is the card, valid? Is there sufficient funds to be able to process the transaction? But we also then had to get to the point, but is the person that's trying to use the card the owner of the card? And I think as we think about payments and the transfer of value within some of these consortia, especially when we start to think about, where I'm really passionate about things like, in-vehicle commerce, for instance, are there additional standards that need to be set not only by MOBI, but by organizations such as Visa to be able to appropriately manage and accommodate these new types of transactions?
Yeah, great point.
I could almost riff off of that if you want me to, Chris.
Go.
I mean, identity being one of the holy grails of the internet is yet to be solved and resolved. But again, that comes down to just a short point, really. Just systems designs, right? Who are, even when you have technological solutions that can start to provide you with more interesting solutions on that front. It's still become a huge task to then, if you haven't designed it right, and you always have to make this persuasion piece to people that actually, look, sovereign identity, or people carrying around the identity themselves, and is it interoperable, and is it permissionless, and how does this possibly work? But that the solutions are with a sovereign identity are going to be so much better than having centralized identity systems that we have currently. Even though they're at least effective, that's just going to be another 5-10 years before we manage. Even if people are persuaded in here that is the solution, before you get to that point, it's just a really difficult piece. So lots of things come to play. That probably wasn't the clearest point, but I think you kind of know where I'm heading.
I'll add to Shiv's point and say, I do like the GAIA framing, but let's be very clear about what the identity is what the I in GAIA really is pointing to, which is in a consortium, it's the identities of the participants in the consortium, but not necessarily the identities of all the individuals and to the point of the VID assets, being tracked on the network, right? And this is important because so much of the digital identity space since the beginning has been very Microsoft Active Directory focused, right? It's been about, here's the central actor who maintains the big directory of names and passwords and profiles. And hey, if you want to talk to somebody about your employment history, you point them to your LinkedIn repository, right? You don't show them your collection of accomplishments and diplomas and degrees in a digital form. You point them at a central portal to show them, hey, I claim that I graduated from Harvard or whatever. And that's kind of broken, right? And so it's important when we think about the role of consortia that no one's confused about, this, that we don't mistakenly think that the consortia is the one who defines the identity or somehow awards identity to every participant of the network. That still should be pushed to the edge. And self-sovereign identity, user-centric identity, which really has now flourished because it matches so well to the blockchain way of working, is an embodiment of that. It allows us to say, okay, this might be a consortium of banks, but all banks really know about their users is an identity that could be portable between these banks, that shows up in the form of a public key from that individual, where the private key is held in their wallet. And that person now has a lot more agency in such a network than they ever did on the Visa network, right? Or than they do on a traditional, more centralized network. So yeah, I just want to help reassure people that the identity role in these kind of blockchain consortia doesn't suddenly return us to a centralized view of how identity works.
Yeah. So I wanted yeah, great. Identity is in some sense the key primitive for an IoT economy, but it's much more complicated. So I want to really dig in on the monetization aspects of consortiums now. And I want to go back to Visa because there's an interesting footnote to that story, which is after 40 or 45 years of being a member-owned organization, Visa in 2008 did what at the time was the world's largest IPO and became a traditional company. And it was because they'd created so much value in the walls of the club. And at the same time, right, there was even more value being created outside the Visa network with the payments processors and all of these applications built on top. And so I think that's a great model to think about, what's possible to monetize inside the network, what properly belongs inside the network versus what opportunities are available outside to the members building on the shared infrastructure of the network.
I'll jump in. I've been using a phrase a lot recently called minimum viable governance, and the idea has been that the best kind of governance for a blockchain network for these kinds of cooperative networks is the one that tries to do the least, that tries to push as much of the value creation and value capture to the edge. And abstracting this out of blockchain, pre-blockchain, the best example I can come up with, some may disagree, but is not Visa, but ICANN, the organization that runs the topmost level of the internet domain name system. When you register a domain name, you're not actually registering it with ICANN. You're registering it with a domain name registrar who is one of 200 different organizations who each have a contract with ICANN, right? But they're the ones who do the nuts and bolts of registering consumers and the domain names that they want, but also making sure that those domain names can be portable from one registrar to another. That portability is guaranteed by that contract each of those registrars have with ICANN. Then in exchange, ICANN lets those domains that those entities register go into the top level of the domain name system, right? When you look up google.com or whatever, it resolves to that. So that is an example. ICANN could easily have said, hey, let's get into the business of registering domain names ourselves, of competing with our members, right? Let's get into the business of providing value add services on top of DNS. Let's then go public. If they did that, that would have created a much more dangerous kind of entity, one that would have put, I think, the resiliency of the global internet much more at risk. And by pushing it to the edge, they created a much more resilient environment. And they did that by, they funded themselves by asking for, I think it's $1, maybe it's less, per domain name that gets registered, which is a fraction of the total value that is captured at the edge and is a uniform price. And I think it varies by which TLD you use. Anyways, so they came up with kind of a simple model to be able to fund the the activity at the core. And I think that's inspiration for, or should be inspiration for the way that we design these other networks. Is how do you push that the heavy lift and the value capture to the edge as much as possible.
Maybe it comes back down again to the Bill Gates sort of saying, how does the platform effectively give more value to its users than it takes itself? Because if it's taking more, then it's not a platform anymore, right? Something else. And we're doing that at Pool right now. We're also thinking, so what does Pool do, by the way? It's in essence, it's there to be a platform for all those data unions, right? There's some common infrastructure problems. There's some GAIA issues. We call them GOPES. So which governance, privacy, ethics, security, sort of the similar, I think. But again, identity is a big part of that, right? How do you identify a data union? How do you identify a data buyer? Do you have to then is our job to whitelist them or do nothing, right? And to have a completely permissionless free-for-all system, which probably doesn't work if you're trying to create trusted data systems, right? But then how do you, again, as Brian said, like, how do you get that minimal viable governance where you're pushing it off to the edge, right? And, you know, someone in our team said, right, let's make a data union ourselves as an example. And as soon as, like, no, as soon as the platform starts also creating its own customers, in essence, then people know where that's going, right? Which is that you're going to eat everyone else's lunch. And so no one will trust you. So, you know, all these things come to the fore, and it's actually really difficult, I think, to when you're from a position of a startup, right? If you're starting these things from scratch, to really stick to some very strong principles, because there aren't like obvious frameworks for this. Like starting a corporation is pretty easy. People get that to an extent, right? You've got some shareholders and this is where you're going, right? But starting these things is very difficult, which is why we're talking about just a handful of examples that really succeed.
Yeah, I would say I would add a couple of comments here. I mean, I think, you know, the whole platform aspect that we've talked about a bit here, and the Uber example that was mentioned earlier. I mean, really, as I look at that type of a model, that is where, you know, value is really created for one entity through others' use of that particular platform. I think from a true consortium perspective, what we strive for is where value is created because we are all using that particular platform. And I think that's a key differentiator as we think about some of these, you know, various consortiums. I think, you know, Chris, though, to your original question around what revenue opportunities might there be, I mean, we've talked about some of them. I mean, things like transaction fees, subscription fees, et cetera. I think what might be really interesting in this space is thinking about, are there also consumer fees here? Are there actually direct to consumers fees that, you know, because there are unique services that are created, which they value. I look at things like, you know, the traditional connect fees for a connected vehicle today. Maybe there's marketplaces that can be enabled. Parking comes to mind as an example. You know, XM and subscription satellite radio is kind of another aspect as well. And then I keep coming back to my favorite, which is vehicle commerce, and really thinking about how, you know, frictionless payments within the vehicle that are contextually aware can fundamentally change the way that you know, that our interactions with certain types of merchants when we're in our car, or even the car itself, will change. I mean, I think about when I'm exiting a parking lot, why do I need to stop, pull a credit card out of my wallet and pay? Why can't my car pay for me? And I think, you know, that's really where I see a tremendous amount of value that can be created for the entire network and all of the actors within the network. I think one of the core considerations that we really have to take, that we have to be focused on, is how do we structure these revenue opportunities in order to encourage use and drive the network effect, because it will ultimately create value for the entire network.
Great. So I'm going to open it up to questions from the chat line and the people listening. We've had a great conversation. We could go on for at least a couple more hours on this, or at least I could. But let's open it up. Annabelle, can you take us through some of the questions from the chat line?
Sure, we have one here. Do you see a need for cryptocurrency on those consortia platforms for easy (parentheses financial close parentheses) settlement on platform chain, or do you see connecting those platforms to the traditional payment settlement platforms?
I can jump in with a shortish answer, which is to say, why would you build it any other way if you weren't going to connect it with crypto? Ultimately, that should be everyone's technical vision at this point, because it's actually just far more convenient, and it's where the world is going. You can do a lot more with it. So if you're not building for crypto at the heart of it, then you're going to fail over the long term.
I think there's a couple different scenarios embedded in that question. One is, does a consortium network have a native cryptocurrency to it, right? And absent something like mining, most of these enterprise networks do not have mining activities. The consensus mechanisms do not depend on proof of work or need an incentive mechanism for people to stand up nodes to compensate them for that. Most of the time, nodes are stood up out of intrinsic value. It's a participants in a banking network or a blockchain network. There's an intrinsic value to running a node to get your business done. You don't need to be paid per CPU cycle to stand up a node. So there's a couple of different angles to this. One is, are there bridges that will be built, kind of to Shiv's point, between assets on these kinds of networks and assets on other kinds of, whether it's public cryptocurrency networks or CBDC networks as those come online and the like, and almost certainly there will be. I mean, there's already plenty of protocols to do this kind of thing, plenty of projects. Like at Hyperledger, we have something called Cactus, which is all about bridging between different networks and doing coordinated transactions across them so that you're paying for an item, it settles on the payment rail, and it settles as an asset transfer on the consortium chain at the same time, right? There's another question, though, which is, do you want a native token within the network, which is, I think, really more Rudolph's question, as a form of settlement within the network? And I think there's a challenge there, which is if you come up with, something that is an embedded currency, then it suddenly has free floating value. It's suddenly, and it's not even one that is as easy to control as, say, frequent flyer miles or other types of microcurrency initiatives. You have one that, on the plus side, can settle transactions quickly if everyone could agree on what the value of that token is. But ultimately, turning that token into fiat it suddenly depends on somebody else valuing that token in some way. And so you start to introduce all the difficult incentives, complications that come from a portably traded token like this when it comes to speculation, when it comes to hype, when it comes to people trying to push certain things that can work against the interests of trying to make the network work as a whole. So there's a third option, which is a token that's on network but attached to essentially an IOU from somebody to turn that token individually into a dollar somewhere in a bank account, right? And that's going to be different because an IOU from one bank is not the same as an IOU from another bank. That's the basis of a lot of international transactions out there and FX, right? And so that's complicated to do essentially what are stable coins. You could see one entity step up the way like Circle has or Tether has, arguably, to say we'll back these tokens, and then there's some financial risk in that. Like, how credible is that as an organization, and how credible is their ability to turn that IOU into a dollar in a bank account, right? So there's at least three different ways to consider doing that. I think using these networks to settle transactions quickly is very interesting, but I think we've got to find a way for it not to suddenly introduce the volatility and potential for fraud that sometimes these kinds of networks bring with them.
Yeah, if I can add two quick comments. One is, I think we actually do need to connect to the existing payment rails because of the fact that consumers are finicky. And ultimately, we need to get access to where the money is, which right now is on those traditional payment devices and accounts. And so that's going to drive the trial and the adoption that we seek. I do think there is a role for digital currencies. But again, I think digital currencies and central bank digital currencies to be able to have that atomic settlement of these transactions. I think we have to be incredibly mindful, though, of the valuation risk that you mentioned, as well as just the cost to transact.
Can I maybe pose the counter, which is to say, look, if you have a situation where it looks like PayPal now is going to onboard a number of cryptocurrencies onto it, and accept them basically, why sit there fretting about this? Just build for Brian, you set up a really nice schema of ways of answering that question, which are all right, and I didn't certainly go into. But if you just take the simple use case of kind of how do you allow customers to pay for services, then isn't it just far simpler to think about it, because it's far more scalable? Think about it in terms of building for the future with tokens and with crypto and on the blockchain, and doing it that way, or even just adopting, you know, the tokens that are already there, like i.e. just use USDC and say, fine, we'll just use this as the payment token.
So let's move to another question. Annabelle?
Yeah, let me read Andreas's comment and then move into the next question. Why not let people buy into the network value through a network token that measures the usage of the network? You do not need mining. You need to make the network resources scarce. Therefore, as usage goes up, the value goes up. Next question. Considering that network value creation is a collaborative effort, any attrition in the network may require value recalibrations. What are your thoughts on ensuring resiliency in the networks? Is recalibration of value at regular intervals or as continuous exercise a good idea?
You know, one of the best things about the way that the internet grew in the early days was that they did not meter it by the byte. You know, they did it by capacity, but you know, you know, your dial-up connection. I mean, I know this is different for people on cell networks, and it's one reason why you know, low bandwidth cell networks, you know, I think I grew differently and had some severe limitations. But at the core of the internet, it wasn't about metering per byte. And it didn't matter if the packet that you were trying to send, you were sending to the computer next to you or to a computer on the other side of the planet, right? There was no worry about rivalrous goods when the cost of tracking and trying to pay for all this stuff would have overwhelmed the cost of just providing the network facility, you know, straight out. And you know, half a generation later, everyone criticized the open source community by saying, well, you guys are fools. You're giving away this tremendously valuable thing. You should at least be asking for a penny a copy, $1 a copy. If you just asked for that little bit, wouldn't you all end up, you know, much richer and able to write more open source software? There are a lot of times where a focus on monetization would have killed the goose laying the golden eggs, right? And if instead there's, and I like to talk about this as the distinction between extrinsic value and intrinsic value, right? The intrinsic value of the internet was to be able to wire us all up, to share information more quickly, email people and video conference with people on the other side of the planet. Like that was, we build value at layers above TCP/IP, right? Extrinsic value is when you're paid to do something, when you're paid to deliver a service, and for you, it's just kind of like bricklaying, you know? And I think that distinction is sometimes lost when everyone thinks the right way to build these networks is to come up with sophisticated compensation and incentivization schemes so that everybody who can be motivated purely by greed or purely by financial self-interest can build something bigger. But that's not reflective of how we've really built community platforms and community technologies historically. I think if, and most of the enterprise blockchain networks that I see being set up do not worry about monetizing transactions. They say, right, if you can stand up a node, go ahead and do it. And let's get nodes going. And let's worry later about trying to balance out people providing resources to the network with people consuming resources. Because for now, we're talking about a de minimis number of transactions, right, to support large value creation. And so the idea of that having to engineer these monetization schemes and incentives is not reflective, I think, of the reality of how these stuff are being deployed, and frankly, not as needed as people think it might be.
I'd also say it's really easy to get incentive schemes wrong with horrible results.
Maybe the counter of that is actually the data economy, right? Which is where people have either said one of a few things, everything's either got to be private. And if you put a monetary value on data, in a sense, you're kind of denuding someone's human dignity, right? Because you can't sell your kidneys, you shouldn't be able to sell your data either. In a sense, or that it should be, you know, the kind of Tim Berners-Lee ODI model, Open Data Institute model, which is, you know, where everything should be open, right? Don't charge for it all, right? Just like the internet. It turns out those two things have ripped off lots of people in many instances and actually created terrible markets for this stuff. Because in order to source this data now, you can't actually go to people and say, we'll pay you a little bit for it and thank you, and then we'll use it. And do it openly. You have to kind of, you know, spy on users and obfuscate how you collected that data. You don't end up with any decent provenance. You end up with these dark data markets, and they're all, you know, all the data ends up siloed. So let's hope the car industry doesn't do something similar in that sense. If you added monetization into the piece and allow people to pay for that, then they can take a choice, right? And that actually creates an open, trusted market for data. So in fact, that weirdly works the other way as well, maybe.
So I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to maybe do a little close and tell a little story. We've had a number of really interesting topics come up about the platforms where the goal is to deliver more value for the members rather than the platform owner, where the goal is not to create a monopoly. We've talked a lot about data. And data in particular, I think, is the perfect club good for these networks. And Shiv, you're deep into that. I think very often there's a mistake in how we think about data. The Economist had a cover of a magazine, data is the new oil, and everybody was saying data is the new oil. And I think that missed the most important thing about data, which is data is not a normal good. Data is non-rivalrous. Data is the perfect good for to be provided by a club. Markets don't handle data very well on their own, so the data platforms for good or for the good of the members, I think is a great use for consortiums. So the final story I want to close with is I was talking to, and we talked a lot about integrity and human dignity with data as well, and the dangers of selling. So I wanted to close the story, a conversation I had with my old boss, Gil Pratt. Gil was the CEO of the Toyota Research Institute, former head of MIT's CSIL Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, professor emeritus there, the father of the autonomous car, ran the DARPA Grand Challenge, really an amazing person. Gil and I were over a beer one night talking about the future of work and what happens to work when AIs do human jobs better than humans in everything, the distant future someday. And Gil thought for a minute and took a sip of his beer and said, well, maybe in the end, what humans have that can never be replicated is their preferences, right? Their consumption choices, their utility functions. It's essentially something that's unique to a human being. It's subjective. It can only be found out through reveal, to transactions, through movements and things, and can't be replicated by machines. And so, making sure that we create a world where people can monetize their data, I think, is an important thing for the future, because it may be that in the end, without that, other avenues for monetizing human activity become more and more difficult for a lot of people. All right, I think we're exactly out of time. Thank you all for a really engaging discussion. Great to have you all. I'm sure we're going to get lots of follow-up on this panel. Annabelle, any closing items?
Excellent panel. Thank you all. I wish everyone a beautiful day. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.